Hi, everybody. My name is Fran Bernstein. I'm an associate professor of history and disability studies at Drew University. And this semester, I'm a visiting fellow here at NYU in the departments of Russian and Slavic studies. I am absolutely delighted to be able to introduce Maria Galmarini, who is an associate professor of history and global studies at William and Mary, and received her PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Before coming to William and Mary, she held a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard and was also an assistant professor at James Madison University. She is the author of a whole bunch of wonderful things, and I urge you to read absolutely every one of them. She is the author of the monograph, The Right to Be Helped, Deviance, Entitlements, and the Soviet Moral Order, which came out in 2016. And she has published articles in the Bulletin of the History of Medicine, Slavic Review, Historical Research, European History Quarterly, and the Russian Review. She also was the 2018 prize winner from the Disability History Association Best Article of the Year. And she recently completed an MS on the history of blind activism during the Cold War, from which I think she'll be talking today.
Thank you. Thank you, Fran, very much for this introduction. Thank you to Yanni for inviting me to be here, to the Jordan Center, and to Sasha Shtalnik for all the logistics behind it. So we're running this as a workshop, and let me actually share my screen here. Prosthetics and Politics in Cold War Europe, the case of blind activist technology collaborations. I hope some of you had the chance to read the pre-circulated paper. If you didn't, I hope you will be interested in going back to it after this conversation. I want to tell you a bit about the genealogy of this project, this particular piece. Then I'll show you some images and summarize some of the main points that I try to make in this piece. So the draft that you read for today became a self-standing article, but it used to be part of chapter 7 of my book manuscript, which is on the ERC, the European Regional Committee of the World Council for the Welfare of the Blind. So it's a regional branch founded in 1964. In 1984, it changed the name to European Blind Union, and it still exists today as European Blind Union. For the larger project, I interviewed several of activists, former activists and contemporary current activists, including the current president of EBU, who just by chance happens to live in my hometown in Italy, but I didn't know. I met him. First time I encountered his name was in the archives in Moscow, and then I tracked him down in my hometown, which is kind of cool, I think. So this ERC was a pan-European institution. It had members from the East and the West, and it was based on collaborations to advocate for blind people across Europe. It collaborated on several projects with more or less success. In the larger chapter, I talk about their collaborations on issues such as braille printing and journalism, resorts for blind people across international vacation, basically for blind people, sports, blind sports. And I also talk about their collaborations on social policy. And what I discovered is that while social policy seemed to be less tractable and less easy to agree on, it became a terrain of consensus in the early 1980s when neoliberalism hit the blind organizations of Europe really hard, and they found consensus on issues of social policy. Technology was initially part of this chapter, but then it became too large. So I decided to write a self-standing piece on their technology collaborations. The story I tell here starts in the 1950s, and I talk about attempts to collaborate in a divided world. At that time, the the blind movement, the international blind movement, was not united. There was the World Council for the Welfare of the Blind, which operated largely in the United States and Western Europe. And the East was developing its own intra-socialist collaborations. So any collaboration attempt within technology in the 50s and 60s was strictly divided. Instead, with the detente of the 70s, things changed, and the Eastern European blind unions, including the Soviet Blind Union, were admitted into the larger international organization. And this European branch in particular proved to be a very conducive terrain for technology collaborations. These activists met regularly, often in the capitals of the East, for clear reasons of logistics, like visa applications, hard currency, and how hard it was to get for the East European counterparts or activists. But in the paper, I talk more specifically about a technology conference that they organized in Stockholm. And here are pictures from the exhibition entitled "To See with Technology" that was set up during the conference itself. And here you see the conference space. And the reason why I'm showing you these pictures is that the conference was fully accessible. There were handrails with Braille written on it. There was enough space for people to move around with their white canes. The man you see there with the white cane, with the long cane, is André Nicole, French activist who at that time was the president of the ERC, European Regional Committee of the Blind. There are several other persons. The person who is checking out that device is the Italian Giuseppe Foucault, for instance. You see also Foucault there reading on the handrail. The exhibition, the space, was fully accessible. So these activists were very aware of issues of access, issues of environment. However, and this is one of the main points of this paper, when they talked about technology and when they presented their papers, when they printed the proceedings of their papers, they talked about technology as though technology was completely neutral, apolitical. Existing in a vacuum, a social, political, and economic vacuum. I argue in this paper that they did so strategically. They strategized on the modernist view of technology as apolitical and neutral in order to be able to collaborate. Collaboration for them was vital because it meant pooling resources, scarce resources, to share information on the design, on the production of any type of assistive technology, on the dissemination of assistive technology. It didn't work, as I argue ultimately in the paper, and for several reasons, the dream of collaboration crashed. But before we go to that, in this image here, so this is from the proceedings of the 1974 Stockholm conference. This is images from the paper presented by the Polish activist. He's talking about this electrophthalm, which, as you can read here, those are experts from the conference proceeding, is an electric eye, so a device that converts visual input into vibrations. Tactile input, in this case, vibrations. You see there are schemes, right, that graphs that represent a device. And then there is that image, the blind man and his prosthetic device, completely in a vacuum. There is nothing around them. There's not even the floor, right? Nothing is represented. And this was supposed to go with the message, as one of the activists said, a device is good. If a device is good, it's good. It doesn't matter where it's produced, where it comes from, except it does. But the image was supposed to highlight, to emphasize this neutrality. It doesn't matter. When I look at that image, I'm struck by the irony that the image to me gives a sense of isolation. The man and the device are completely isolated, while the purpose of these devices was to integrate or facilitate integration. This is something I don't have in the paper. I actually came up with as I was preparing this presentation. So in the 1980s, early 1980s, the dream of collaboration came to an end. There are several reasons why. One is the Détente ended. So collaboration between the two superpowers ended. It was more and more difficult to pursue it, even at the level of prosthetics, as I say. The second reason is that there was a European-wide recession. So it became harder and harder to find resources. And when activists appealed to the European Economic Community, they rarely received funding. And as one activist said, and I'm going to quote him here, the European community cannot even agree on such issues as railway fares. So let alone give money for our projects, and to those countries who are beyond the Iron Curtain. That was also part of the story. And then the early 1980s were a time of crisis for the two halves of Europe in different ways. For the West, neoliberalism meant that it was no longer strategically convenient to separate politics and prosthetics. As neoliberalism started, the Western activists began to make the point that we need social policies that work together with devices, with technological devices. So they reversed their argument about the neutrality of technology. And for the Eastern activists, well, they were going through their own perestroikas. There was no longer money to travel. There was absolutely, it was not a priority for their states to send them around the world and Europe as ambassadors of the welfare socialist state. So for that reason, collaboration became impossible. The dream fell apart. The larger takeaway from this story, and this is what I want to end with before we go into the discussion, is that, and I'm going to read it from the conclusion of the paper. Through a focus on technology collaboration, this article ultimately deconstructs stereotypes about the seclusion of Eastern Bloc's disability activism from the Western disability movement. In the second half of the 20th century, the Cold War geopolitical conflict created real constraints, and blind activist technology cooperation did not lead to major results. But disability knowledge nonetheless flew across borders and always moved in circular ways. The practices, philosophies, and technologies that historians of disability celebrate when they discuss the growth of the disability rights movement in the Western world did not, in fact, develop in a vacuum. Rather, they resulted from constant debates and exchange of ideas with the Soviet and East European colleagues. This is my major point, and it's also the major point that I tried to make in the larger manuscript from which this project, to which this project is related. Last thing that I want to say is that as there is a war going on, right? More people with disabilities will be part of this world. And it is very important, I think, to make people with disabilities visible during conflicts, but also to think about collaborations in politically divided worlds and contexts. There will be a post-bellum to this war, and people with disabilities will continue to benefit from collaboration across political divides. So I think it is important for us to think about this topic.
Maria Cristina, one of the things I was really struck by is even in this context of collaboration, which crosses borders, there's such a distinction between the way Soviets deal with this technology and it's dealt with in the West. And actually, maybe, could you say 2 sentences on that?
Yeah.
for people who haven't read?
Yes, so in the article, I talk about the reasons why it cannot be neutral, like the specific disability policies that provide the terrain onto which technology works, and why there is such a difference. So I bring up a few examples in the text. One of them, for instance, is the Russian All Union of the Blind. I call it VOS, Всероссийское общество слепых. Their technological focus was almost exclusively on labor technology. So devices that would help blind people be employed in sheltered workshops. They were indeed very interested in other types of technology, so for braille printing, audiobooks, mobility technology, but they didn't focus their attention on designing the type of technology or producing it. In the West, interestingly, they knew that VOS was quite advanced in the production of labor-related technology. But the problem was that that technology that was produced was for use in sheltered workshop at a time when the West was largely moving away from segregated employment. So the question comes up of how do we integrate technology that is designed for a blind-only environment into a mainstreamed environment? And the same problem comes up with education. These activists were very interested in sharing information on so-called tiflopedagogy, right? So pedagogy for the blind, right? Devices, didactic materials, technology. But as the West is thinking more and more about mainstreaming, the only way to share information, to produce didactic materials together, is to pretend that they can work either in mainstream or in segregated, where they don't, right? Let's think, I'll give you an example, not from this paper, but from another paper that I'm working on. Let's think about tactile maps or children books with embossed reliefs, right? Now, one thing is you have a braille book with embossed illustrations, right? Relief, tactile illustration, to be looked by only blind children. A completely different process pedagogically is in a mainstream context, when you have sighted children, children with low vision and fully blind children, looking at the same textbook, but being able to interact with it, each in their own ways. So the technology for producing a relief, a geographical map, or an embossed illustration is the same, but the didactic that supports it is very different. So those are a couple of examples from the paper and from other research to show how the policies and the approaches to disability matter a lot in the way technology is designed and used and disseminated.
So given all that, my question is, you talk about this, privileged information, the Soviet case, computer forces, right? Training a very small number of blind children, teenagers, as opposed to, integrating in the West. And you use the phrase supercrip, right? Which is a great phrase to apply to the Soviet context. And the thing that I thought most about that was that you're talking about Stehanovitism, right? You're talking about focusing on these privileged few because you're not focusing on all the rest of them.
Yes.
Right? And how very undemocratic the structure is in the Soviet Union compared to what's in Europe. And I'm wondering if that if you ever see that changing, right? If there's ever, if this process you're describing ever becomes slightly, I mean, I know now there's an inclusivity focus on education in Russia, but do you see any sort of progress before the collapse of the Soviet Union?
I didn't. Yeah, I didn't see changes in that. It was, it was, I do claim there was an advocacy movement that I strongly believe in, but how democratically widespread it was, it's a completely different story. So what VOS was good at, and also all the other socialist blind unions, what they were good at was employment in sheltered workshops, provision of specialized housing. They were very good at that. Provision of recreational services, resource for blind people, but it was all in a parallel world, right? So that was democratic. When it came to the so-called publicity, so really challenging, deconstructing images of blindness in order to create the premises for inclusion. When it came to that, it was very elitarian. It was the super crip that was showcased. So the activists who traveled the world were an example of super crip, and I claim that there were no female activists because they didn't fit as female activists with this image of a blind woman who travels the world and is an activist. A blind woman could be at best a good housewife. And so there were all these, showcase stories, and I'm not saying they were Potemkin stories. They were actually, they're real people who struggled throughout their lives with the support of VOS to overcome their blindness. But they were the tip of the iceberg, right? And the rest was kept invisible, provided with recreational services, with healthcare, with employment in parallel spaces, but kept invisible. What was shown very publicly was the super blind, right? And I didn't see that change. I really didn't.
Okay, and then one other question, if I may. You do a really good job of describing the sort of the horizontal collaboration that goes on across Europe. I'm wondering about vertical collaboration. What is the relationship between this organization and the other Soviet organizations, either focusing on prosthetics or other kinds of assistive technologies? And, for instance, when they're exporting materials, do they use med-export, right? Are they applying the same patents and permission to trade in foreign currency? Do you have any sense of that?
I don't. I didn't track that down. So for the Soviet Union specifically, in terms of the chain of command went all the way, right? So VOS was part of the MINSOBIES, the Ministry of Social Welfare. For any issue that pertained to the abroad, it had to receive approval from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the council, right, the Subnarcom. So it had to receive all sorts of permissions. How the import-export technically worked, I've not followed that. I've not researched that part. I know that there was trade. So for instance, Denmark used to buy technology for certain type of labor-related technology from VOS, right? And they were also buying from the GDR guide dogs for blind people, trained guide dogs. So there was trade. How technically that happened, I've not researched that.
I'll start you with a general question. So we're focusing on the text. For those of you who didn't read it, I'm sorry, read it, right? But so we're focusing on the text, and it's an article, right? And where will it be submitted, you think? Or what kind of journal?
I don't know. It was a question I had for you, actually. Where do you think I should send it?
Yeah. But it depends how you want to take it, right? And how you want to develop it. So obviously, so what you have here is information which would have been part of a manuscript, so it would have a context, right? And you're putting it here, and so once you put it here, then it's you're working on it to give it a direction, point, the main argument, as opposed to a number of subsidiary arguments. So when I was reading it, well, I've read a lot of your work, right? And I remember one of the key distinctions that you introduced in your earlier work and your current work is that there's a generally speaking Anglo-American approach to disability, and a generally speaking, let's call it socialist, meaning Eastern European approach to disability. these are distinct, right? And it came up again, right here. The one labor-based, the other, I don't know what you want to call it. And then it came into the left. And then the second half of the article, this dichotomy or distinction having left, maybe it doesn't belong, I don't know, right? By the time I got to the second part of the article, then I didn't have track of that anymore. It seems to be belying that neat distinction between East and West. Something else going on there. So if I had a specific question, it would be, so what do we make of that distinction, which is prominent in other things you've written? Maybe I want to talk about what that distinction is for the benefit of the sphere. And then secondly, could that be the focus of the article, or is there a different focus you wanted to have? Meaning, as all of us at some point will make a decision where we say, okay, this is the choice, what actors call the choice, right? I'm going to be this kind of person now, right? So what kind of article do you want it to be, right?
Great question. So what article I want this to be, and then I go back to the socialist model. What article I want this to be. So the issue of audience also, right? So when I wrote this, what I think I had in mind, but again, I have to go back and rethink perhaps. I had in mind something like Jahrbuch of Osteuropa-Geschichte or Kritika, so a journal that is for historians of Russia and Eastern Europe who usually do not think about disability. That's what I had in mind as an audience, as opposed to disability studies or disability history scholars who do not think about Eastern Europe. So the primary audience for me is our crowd, let's say, and push our crowd to think about disability and why it's not simply yet another subaltern. That was the targeted audience, and I would welcome any comments on how to maybe keep that audience and reframe.
An audience of Russianists, Soviet history, that the geographic.
Yeah. Or people who usually study Cold War from an Eastern point of view, Eastern perspective, but do not think about disability. So I would say my audiences are Russian, Eastern European studies, Cold War studies, and just last, I would say disability studies. But maybe I was wrong, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I should reverse that. I really welcome any comment. So with the socialist approach, so for those who do not do disability history, there are several models of looking at disability and people with disabilities have been theorized. One is the so-called medical model. The medical model is a model whereby the focus is on what doesn't work, right? The defect, the pathology. In that model, there is always an expert who fixes up, right? The doctor that fixes blindness or, fixes mobility-related impairments. So the focus is on the impairment, what is not there and should be there, the expert that can fix it, the philanthropist who puts in money for fixing. The social model instead is an approach that was developed in the late 80s, I would say early 90s by scholars. And it says that it distinguishes between impairment and disability and says, yes, there is the impairment, right? The fact that somebody is visually impaired, but then the disability is socially constructed. The disability is created by an environment that is not accessible, by the fact that there is only ink print and not braille, for instance, the fact that, well, it's mostly about environment accessibility, prejudice, right? So society teaches children that their blind peers shouldn't study with them, right? Or don't have the same capabilities. Society supports ideas about isolation, separatedness, the fact that blind people cannot travel around the world, for instance. There are other models as well, but those are the two most well-known. Well, what I discovered is that in the socialist countries, there was yet another approach that's called the socialist approach, which was an interesting mix of those two. Like the medical model, there is a focus on deficit, defect, what is not there. There is an idea of compensating the defect, fixing it, pushing the person to become normal, right? The person with disabilities to become normal, to overcome the disability. But the socialist model also strongly criticized any charitable approach, and instead claimed that it is society that disabled, but not in the social model, right? It's society that disabled. It is a Western capitalism that creates disabilities because Western capitalism does not provide welfare, appropriate institutions, appropriate ophthalmological care, for instance. Of course, the social and political reasons why somebody becomes disabled were very clear in this model, but applied only to the other side, right? Never to ourselves. So the socialist approach was very aware of the politics of disability, but in its own, with its own specific ideological twist. So to give you an example, the current president of the European Blind Union, when he visited the Soviet Union for the first time, he was told, we don't have blind children in the Soviet Union. He was absolutely flabbergasted and asked, where do your blind people come from then? And he related to me this episode in a conversation. And his point was that, well, it was the usual socialist Potemkin village. I told him perhaps, but it also means something else. When they told you we don't have blind children, what they really wanted to tell you, perhaps, was our healthcare system is so well developed that mothers do not deliver blind children, or our children, we have such a good, well-developed healthcare system that we prevent blindness from appearing in children. Now, blindness in old age is natural. Blindness in childhood is caused by the bad conditions of capitalism. That's the discourse behind it.
It wasn't, in other words, he wasn't implying that we don't have a pathology of blindness. It wasn't that.
He was saying that the Soviet Union, I think that what the sentence, we don't have blind children in the Soviet Union meant was, we take so much good care of our children that they do not develop blindness.
This was just sounding a bit like у нас нет секса.
Exactly.
Right?
That's how I understand it.
Yep.
That's exactly how I understand it.
So у нас нет секса meant that we don't have a problem of sex, right?
Yes,
It's
exactly.
not, we don't have this issue. We don't have it, and I was wondering if that's what you mean by also we don't have child blindness.
That's what I think he meant,
It's
right?
not pathology, in other words.
Yeah.
Right.
We take care of it. There are no conditions.
Yeah.
We do have an elderly blind, but that's a natural condition. And the West too considered, for instance, the way that the Western blind unions looked at the third world. They emphasized they have a lot of blind children, while we in the West don't have a lot of blind children. So it's that same mentality in some respects, right? Of shifting the blame or creating hierarchies of more or less developed countries. But also, you, for instance, a very famous sentence that was given in 1981 to a Western journalist asking why the Soviet Union was not participating in the Paralympics. The answer was, there are no invalids in the Soviet Union. Which I claim we should not take at face value. It actually means something else. It means all our people with disabilities are well integrated and they're not invalid per se.
But the opposite is true as well, right? Of course, there were blind children. They were just hidden from sight.
Yes.
Right. They were in special schools that were always, far from the train lines, and that goes for all sorts of other disabilities. So they don't have, like going back to Yanni's point, they're not blind, big B blinds, right? As they would be in the West, but they're definitely there.
Absolutely. So yeah, the socialist approach, it picks and chooses from the models that historians usually use to talk about disability historically. And I think it is important to acknowledge the existence and criticize, critically analyze this other model, but analyze it in its own terms somehow, instead of trying to mesh it within, it's either medical or social.
By the way, what we're referring to, for those who are not Russianists or Sovietologists, there was a time in the late 80s when there was the East-West conversation and understanding through television, through joint television appearances. And some, I think Posner or something asked, so what about sex in the Soviet Union? And someone blurted out, we don't have sex in the Soviet Union. Now, what they meant was that it's not an issue the way it is for you guys. It's not we don't have the same complex as you have. It's not a social issue, and so on and so forth. So Fran and I it sounded very much, we don't have blind people, blind children in the Soviet Union. It sounded very much like that. Yeah. So back to the issue. So the article. So it seems to me that if this is an article that's going to go to the likes of, Russia specialists, East European specialists, that for them, the parts that will be the most interesting, I think, would be the systemic ones, the ways in which now, it seems to me, I mean, what do I know, right? But so that, the intricacies of one or another disability will be interesting, and it's educational. And as we're reading, we learn, but we always learn because we're also attracted to a framework, right? And that's probably the best way to learn, part of the story, in other words. And it seems to me, at least, the story that would be the most appealing would be the one in which disability is framed as systemic particularities, systemic differences, systemic competition. Now again, the one that struck me the most in your earlier writings, and it came up here as well, was that there's a clear statement of we are different, right? Our systems are different, and we handle these things differently. And sort of in the case of state socialism, it's an integral, complete approach to the person as part of the society/state, which is more or less the same thing, right? And we have, I mean, theoretically at least, until they discover that we have unlimited resources to be able to deal with it because every resource is at our disposal, right? Versus another view, which is to view disability as an incapacity and an insufficiency, which you can then compensate for, right? Now, again, you'll tell me, but that kind of statement, it seems, would be the one that would, because a lot of people are still interested, so what did Soviet Union represent? What was state socialism? And what are some of its possible legacies and lessons for today? I think a lot of people look to it still, to try to figure that part out. The ADA, so which model would that fall under, and how would you explain that?
Yeah, so ADA was passed in 1990 by a conservative administration, actually, in the United States. ADA definitely is influenced by the social model because it is about accessibility. Accessibility is key there, and it's about rights, it's about equality, and integration as channels through accessibility and equal rights. What is definitely not there is welfare. To the contrary, ADA is all about cutting dependence on welfare. So it's the burden is not on the state, it is on the private businesses to create an accessible environment, right? It's the school that should create an accessible environment, the restaurant you go into. And it is also very much, I think, part of a legalistic framework whereby if there is no accessibility, here is the rules or the document that you can use to sue eventually the restaurant or the school that doesn't let your kid on a wheelchair go in. So it is definitely informed by the social model, and it cannot be it couldn't be possibly be part of a socialist way of thinking, because it really goes in the opposite direction. It has been criticized for multiple reasons, including the fact that it creates disabled people as consumers.
Yeah.
So it falls in that. Well, the ADA plays a role in my larger project because when we think about international disability, we think about the ADA spreading to Northern Europe, West Germany, and then to the rest of the world, and the entire world adopting it and finally accepting people with disabilities equals. Well, what I say is that no, we like to tell this story after 1988, 1991, when the other models that contributed to the growth of ideas about disability were completely delegitimized. But in the making, in the 70s, as I claim here, there was a lot of exchange and discussion, and it was by comparing notes and arguing that each side, right, or the multiple sides learned and developed their disability approaches. So that, I think, is my bottom line, right? Is this idea that I agree with you, yes, differences, systemic differences are key, but here with technology, there was a decision to disregard them because what mattered was the circulation of knowledge. Well, it was impossible to disregard them, right? The point is that knowledge did circulate, and this part of the story shouldn't be left out.
All right. So this I find very interesting. So as soon as you said this, it made me think of another narrative that I have in my head, which then overlaps with yours. Right? Which is that when I teach to a large audience, what was the Soviet Union? What is its legacy? Its legacy is the forced capitalism to reform itself, right? Beginning in 1917, but especially in 1929, right? It forces capitalism to grapple with its problems, one way or the other. And once the Soviet Union no longer existed, capitalism no longer has to worry about its problems, right? Hence neoliberalism, right?
Very similar.
Yeah, so maybe that's a story you want to make explicit, at the very least in connection with disability. So it's one thing to say, and I think it's interesting, that they came together in Stockholm, and they came together in these groups, and the Swedes and the Dutch and the Danes and all that, and the East Europeans, and they exchanged ideas. But what you're actually saying is something bigger than that, which is they exchanged ideas and forced each other to deal with the problem of disability, right? And that's now gone.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great idea. Actually, I'm going to write it down.
This is from Di Wu. Thank you for this fascinating talk. Could you please elaborate more about the strategic decision to present technology as apolitical or neutral? Why use technology as a focus of collaboration? And were blind activists particularly active in these collaborations compared with other disabled activists? 3 questions.
Yes. So the focus on technology is, again, there were many realms of collaboration. Technology here is at a particular chronological conjunction, I would say, when it's the late 1960s, early 1970s. So you have men go on the moon, right? You have the polarized image. You have collaboration projects going on between the two rival superpowers. And in this context of this collaboration, that is, there is the hope of collaboration uniting humanity. This is the early 70s. That's the spirit, that's the zeitgeist. People with disabilities, and in particular, in this case, blind activists, latch on to all this, and they'd always wanted to collaborate, to pool resources, and they jump on this bandwagon of technology can bring us together. So this is why collaboration is a particularly conducive field to look at. Technology is a particularly conducive field to look at the potential and limits of trans-systemic collaboration. I have a quote in the article from this Ramisa Mannato, this activist, who says, I'm going to read it because it brings home the point of this idea of blind sameness, right? We are blind, we don't see borders, so we are particularly at collaborating. he says it would be absurd if we did not feel the requirement for international collaboration, because we have been the first to overcome divisions between people, and we have recognized each other as brothers on the basis of a disability that does not let us see borders on the map of the world. This idea of blind sameness was brought up all the time, right? We do not see borders on the map of the world. He is not the only one who used that sentence. I saw people using it at a 1983 conference, so 15 years after Amannato used it. So the point is that perhaps more than other disability groups, right, we do not see difference, right? It is a deceitful statement, I claim, because technology does have borders. In the economic systems that support the production of technology, in the specific environments in which technology is applied, the pedagogies, for instance, in which technology is applied, and the systems through which technology is disseminated to just the elite blind who can overcome blindness, or democratically to all blind people. So to answer your question, I picked technology, a particular area of analysis, because it was the talk of the day in the early 1970s. It is not neutral because of the economic systems in which technology operates, because of the disability approaches that different countries have. So going back to the models that I described, and because of the social policies through which technology is or is not distributed, and to whom. Was there another part of the question?
Yeah, it was, the last part was, were blind activists particularly active compared with other disabled activists?
So I'm not sure how to answer this question, because I've not done research in other groups and how they collaborated. I can tell you, however, that there were several international associations that dealt with disability. IR, for instance, International Rehabilitation is one. There were also some organizations that operated internationally with a focus on deafness. The World Council for the Deaf was one of them. How active they were in their technology, in their sharing of technology prototypes, that I have not researched. So I cannot tell if they were more active than others, but they did stress that their blindness made them not see the differences.
I was asking if that covered it, or if you'd like to follow up.
Say it again.
All right. I was asking people if she wanted to follow up.
Okay.
Which she says, thank you.
Sure.
So we had a question at the end.
Yeah. First of all, I'm very sorry I didn't have time to read the paper. I'm in the last few days before my last qualifying exam, and the paper escaped me. But
don't worry.
Good luck for you, perhaps. Maybe, I don't know. But my third field is the global history of disability and public health.
Oh.
So a lot of the things you talked about are very interesting for me. And I would echo,
Yanni, my name is Yanni.
Yanni, I would echo Yanni's point of sort of seeing how both the collaboration and the structural difference challenges capitalism. Another way to put that question might be, even if some of the claims made were sort of disingenuous or false or difficult to verify, how do those things, like, how can we take the critique seriously without taking its reality at face value? And another way to put that, I think, is because in my studies of the historiography, I've realized, as someone who enjoys historical materialism as a way to think about these things, that disability studies is not necessarily interested in questions of political economy much of the time. And given that, I would ask a broad question of, how do you think you can make the political economy explicit, both to play to the Sovietologists and to the people interested in the Soviet Union, but also perhaps to challenge a sort of overwhelming cultural current of some disability studies scholarship. I think disability history is moving in a much more political economy direction now, but disability studies as the sort of big tent movement, I think, has a lot of room to still grapple with how it deals with things like economy. Another way to rephrase Yanni's question, which I think is interesting, is if in the Soviet Union, historical materialism was a way to not acknowledge disability, in the US and in places where this sort of civil rights, liberal idea of disability rights comes about, how did they construct their movement to not challenge capitalism? Because there's so many ways in which the movement is structured to avoid these conflicts with moneyed interest, with state power, in a way that by making it individual, they don't have to pose these challenges. But a specific question I had about some of what you've presented us today. Sorry, I just wanted to get that out there because my exam has me sort of going in all sorts of ways. But my only real point of reference for what you've talked about is Claire Shaw's book on the deaf community. And I was wondering, sort of, if in your research or in your article, I mean, it seems to me that the deaf community in the Soviet Union has a pretty privileged relationship to the state. And I was wondering first how blindness compares to that. Like how the blind community compares to that. And also, did they see themselves as disabled in the same way that the deaf community did in the USSR? In other words, using that idea, what is it? Ethnic in form, no, ethnic in content, Soviet in form. I always
national in content.
There you go.
Socialist, sorry, national in form, socialist in content.
Yeah. So did they see themselves in the same way, or was it different?
Fantastic questions. So I'm going to answer your second question. I'm not going to comment on the political economy part, although I do agree with you that disability studies is still very much focused on representation. While we need to, as historians, we do need to take the material base much more in consideration. And I could talk long about how Voss was all about the material structure. But instead, I'll take your second question. So Claire Shaw's work is fundamental to understand what was going on in the Soviet Union when it came to disability. And the more I research blindness, the more I see parallels. There are, however, also differences. So both blindness and deafness occupied special places in the Soviet taxonomy of disabilities, if you want. In that, those were sensory disabilities that the Soviet science of defectology thought could be compensated. So as opposed to, in common, deafness and blindness had this idea of they can be compensated with adequate pedagogical and rehabilitative and vocational interventions, as opposed to so-called more serious disabilities, such as cognitive disabilities, which were considered too difficult to be compensated in most cases, or as opposed to mobility impairment, which requires environmental interventions. So intervention in the infrastructure, and the Soviet state was not ready to do that. The socialist states of Eastern Europe followed the Soviet model in doing that. Now, the difference between deafness and blindness was considered as more serious than deafness, but still with capacity for compensation. Also, deafness, the way it was conceived in the Soviet Union, and here is the parallel with the nationalities is appropriate, was about communicative issues, right? So it's a language problem, orality versus, learning to speak, right? So overcoming deafness meant overcoming deaf muteness, right? And learning to speak through an oralist method. In the case of blindness, the communicative problem is not there. So in some respects, we don't have with the blind community this need to prove their identity and their belonging to the Soviet community, because they can well hear, receive, and talk about ideological matters. So in that case, their ideological diversity is never an issue. In that case, what is an issue with blindness is more isolation, access to information, right? But there was a blind press that was quite developed. Employment. So in the case of blind people, the issue was employment, was proving capacity, which was less of an issue with deafness. So there are some parallels in the way these sensory disabilities were conceived. Most important is that they could be compensated, therefore there's an investment. They can be showcased with the super crit in both cases, while a wheelchair user cannot be showcased because they cannot even get out of their apartment. How can we showcase, let alone cognitive disabilities, which, you know, I'm not the best person to talk about here. Fran should take on the answer about cognitive disabilities, right? But not now. Not now, but I can tell you that there was no society for autism, right? Or society for people with cognitive disorders, cognitive disabilities, that was so public as Vogue and Voss, the Society for the Deaf and the Society for the Blind. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. And then one other thing I wanted to mention, just about the picture you showed in your slideshow, the one where you said we only see the equipment and the person.
Shall I bring it up again, Sasha?
Well, it's just something I wanted to mention, which is that we also don't see the things this person is hypothetically supposed to see. So it's not just that there's nothing around them, but that the point of the technology is to see things, or to see something, or to see anything. And all we see is blank space.
It's an absolute isolation.
That shows us the deficits in the approach.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you for this comment. Absolutely.
No, when I saw it in the article, I had no idea what it was.
Yeah.
I knew it was something.
Yeah.
Did you have follow-up?
Oh, no, thank you so much.
I'll follow up very briefly. So if I understand what you've been saying about the ADA, for example, and then going back to the comments, what's your name?
Cody.
Cody. Going back to Cody's comment as well, that so the ADA absolves itself of financial responsibility.
Yes.
Is that the
I would say yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And meaning there's no state that is required as a state, qua state, to invest in making a state investment.
There is no state investment, as far as I understand it. The state is there to check on the provision of accessibility mostly, right? Yeah. And check on the fact that rights are enforced.
Yeah.
What about special education? That's federally mandated. It's federally funded.
That is true. That is true. That is true. And yeah, and the push for co-education and state funding. But
outside of education and medicine, there is no funding. Like,
I know. Yeah, no, I know.
So, you know, I'm not an expert on the ADA, right?
In general, I mean, you know more than I do. But it's so far.
It is cutting. It is about the cutting on dependency, right? And that was also the mantra of Western NGOs when they flooded Eastern Europe in the 90s, right? So no institutions, cutting on dependency, on safety nets, right? Really pushing on the right on the individual, and the individual becoming an autonomous citizen with equal rights.
So you build them a ramp, and the rest is up to them, right? Mm-hmm. Is that okay? In contrast to what we're talking about when it comes to, well, certainly Western Europe and Eastern Europe, right? Whereby there has to be some sort of budgetary payout to make someone's life more, make it better. Right?
Yeah. So the interesting case is West Germany, actually. So there is a book by Katharina Heyer on how the ADA was adopted and adopted in West Germany and Japan. So it's the usual story of the idea spreading to the world and being acclaimed as what we all should live by. But in the case of West Germany, this author has an interesting discussion on how the adaptation process was influenced by a strong tradition of a welfare state. Part of my issue there is that it's forgotten how very West German activists developed that tradition by constantly talking with their East German colleagues and colleagues from other socialist countries. So it doesn't come out of nowhere. It was there since before 45, definitely, but it continued to grow through conversations throughout the Cold War period. And these conversations were very much about the legal framework and the state backing up the legal framework, and the state having responsibility for creating social conditions. Now, the big issue here is what actually happened in practice, right? And how widespread these laws, how was the implementation of these laws and for whom, right? And I'm not even going there, because I know from my research that only few institutions were good enough to be showed to foreign visitors, right?
In West Germany.
And in the Soviet Union, anywhere in the socialist countries.
Sorry, unfortunately, also missed on the existence of this paper. I'm very sorry.
No worries.
To be a, not a particularly intelligent or relevant question, but my main entry point, as I into the subject, as I told you, is my best Russian friend who is blind and went through all these schools for the blind and specialized musical schools for the blind, of which there were a few in the Soviet Union and still in Russia today. And then, he went through university and is now a history professor. But speaking of educational technologies, it seems maybe helpful to distinguish between obviously the much more numerous important educational technologies, maybe at the for those specialized, sheltered schools for the blind in the Soviet Union, versus technologies and provisions for university level education, where there was no segregation in the same way. And I'm just wondering, whether, at the university level, where this Soviet policy of sheltering students was not, no longer enforced, the comparison between university education for the blind in the West versus the Soviet Union was these were much more similar types of practices and technologies than at school.
So thank you for your question. Very few blind people received a university education, and especially they couldn't choose their major, right? So only a few majors were open to blind people, and history was one of them. It was considered approachable enough for even blind people, right? So this is really the logic there. Now, in terms of accessibility and the provision of technologies, the real new technology that was provided free of charge to blind students at the university level were readers. So helpers, right? Sighted students who would read to them. This is before, digitized access to Braille, right? So we are talking about the before 89, 91 period, and the help that was given, it was readers. There were no changes in the infrastructure. As far as I know, blind students were housed in dorms for the blind, not together with other university students. And you can chat with your friend if he has a different story. But as far as I know, the majority were housed in dorms for the blind. So the wards they inhabited was mostly still a blind ward. But it is true, university education was open. Some majors were open to blind people, and they were provided with free access to readers. I don't know of any specific technology for university students. Here I talk about blind people as computer programmers. There was like one specialized program to train blind people as computer programmers in the early 1970s and throughout. But it was so elitarian. You had to be like a mathematical genius to get into it. And so it's not representative, I think. It was there, however. So this is also part of the socialist model. The socialist model of blindness experimented with all sorts of ideas and approaches that fit with the economy of a centrally planned economy and sheltered workshops and segregated education, but for a few blind.
What was it about computer programming?
Yes, so in the late 60s and early 1970s, with all the breakthroughs in computer science, everywhere in the world there is a movement not only to teach computer programming and basic database skills to blind students, but also to develop a profession for the blind as computer programmers. There were a few professions at that time that were considered accessible to blind people: massage therapists, music teachers or professional musicians, telephonists, for instance. And there was a movement to push worldwide to push for computer programming as a specific blind profession. So this movement, these developments were followed by the socialist countries, but in the Soviet case in particular, the idea was not to teach computer science to everybody, all blind children in elementary school, but to create an elite of particularly talented mathematicians, blind mathematicians, who would become computer programmers in particular. So the profession was developed, but for those few who could do sophisticated computer programming instead of database operations for everybody.
But why computer programming and not something else? What is it about computer programming?
Well, it doesn't require mobility around the space, right? It doesn't require, the moment you create manuals in Braille, you can learn it. It was a new profession for everybody. So in some respect, there was hope that it couldn't be stigmatized for blind people. And in general, with blind advocacy, there has been historically the tendency to create specialized professions or to compartmentalize blind people into certain professions. In Czechoslovakia, for instance, telephony, so everything that was related to the new technology of the telephone, relatively new, was in the hands of blind people, right? Because they hear, they don't need to see. And the same, I think, was applied to computer science. You don't particularly need to see the moment that you have instructions in Braille.
Is there something about your paper you'd like to ask us about how we perceived it, or?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions actually, and one perhaps Cody and Fran can help me with, as people who are deep into disability history. I received comments from other readers that it is not clear why I use both prosthetics and assistive technology. And I wonder if that struck you as a problem, my use of those two as synonyms.
I didn't understand it.
Prosthetics and assistive technology.
Yeah, so when I read it, I couldn't understand. Sure.
Yeah, I received comments from another reader saying that my use of them is problematic, right? Because I don't distinguish between them and I use them as synonyms. And I wonder if you have thoughts about that.
Well, in the Russian, they're used interchangeably,
Mm-hmm.
right, at least for the 40s, 50s, 60s.
do you have a sense, like, not that you would know who the comments are from necessarily, but do you have a sense what this person, like, is this a person with familiarity with disability studies or
No,
disability
no,
history?
actually, no, who is the person, she's a colleague in a
Oh,
writing group at my
Well,
institution.
Yeah.
So
I
she
think
has no familiarity with disabilities, so she just thought, why do we have two terms?
when I hear it, I mean, I'm just reacting from, not having read it, but when I hear that you're using them both, it seems to me that maybe just go, like, assistive technology is really just a bigger tint for what, like, prosthetics are assistive technology, but not all assistive technology
Yeah.
is prosthetics. And then I also think prosthetics as a historical way of dealing with disability have a particular history that not all assistive technologies have. So in addition to Fran's point, I might just historicize prosthetics and then sort of show that syllogism of, prosthetics are a kind of assistive technology, but it's not all that I'm talking about here. So I need to use a bigger term to explain the variety of the group, if that makes sense.
Yes.
The other distinction that's made is that prosthetics are supposed to replace the body, whatever that means, right?
Oh, yeah.
Assistive technologies are always seen as in
Augmented.
addition to, augmented.
Yeah, so the title of the exhibition, from which I showed you some images, is To See with Technology. And that to me is this, like, so technology there is prosthetics, right? If it is replaces not a body organ, but a sense, it becomes a prosthetic. I do definitely agree prosthetics is a subgroup of assistive technology, and I'm talking about the larger, including prosthetics. Completely honestly, the title Prosthetics and Politics, in my mind is, very famously we talk about aesthetics and politics, right? But nobody thinks about the implication of prosthetics and politics, right? So the title was supposed to gesture to that. I don't know how
there's also that
effectively.
narrative, that disability studies idea of narrative.
No, I'm so tired of narrative prosthetics, aren't you?
Well, I am, but I'm just saying that would be another reason I think to at least to keep it in the title, because there's many ways in which prosthetic as a historical item, as a disability studies item. I mean, I don't think it's productive at all for what you're trying to say here, but I do agree that I think it has a certain broad base.
And it has a materiality, well, assistive technology too.
But I agree.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm still not sure where I should send it, but your comments about reframing it definitely helped with understanding what to bring up, what is most interesting to a broader audience. So
And we continue to be available. So
Thank
if
you.
you want to send more drafts along and all that, I'm sure I
Thank
would be
you.
happy. I'm your target audience because I don't know anything. No, I'm serious. I'm serious. So when I saw prosthetics, I think of artificial legs, right?
Yeah.
That's why I don't know because I'm that ignorant, right? But as I said, I could be your target audience.
To bring up the part of the problem at this point is that I've been writing about this in all sorts of incarnations for 2 years now. So when I write something new, I was like, I already said that. I already said it somewhere else. Why do I need to repeat it here? But yeah, I have to find that golden middle.
Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.